Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I should lay my cards on the table right at the start by saying that I was a very active campaigner for Remain in the EU referendum, and therefore, like a lot of my fellow campaigners, rather devastated by the result. But as most of you will know, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, has said Brexit means Brexit, and therefore for most of my talk I will assume that we will indeed leave the European Union. I have to say in parenthesis that it did strike me that Brexit means Brexit was about as helpful a statement as a banana is a banana. The timetable for withdrawal is already reasonably well known. The Prime Minister has said we will invoke Article 50, which is the clause of the Lisbon Treaty which allows a member state to leave the European Union by the end of March 2017. There will then be 2 years of negotiations with the other 27 member states on the withdrawal mechanisms, which are extremely complicated. And only after that, therefore, in March 2019, at the earliest, can we expect Britain to be outside the European Union. Now, that will be quite a wrench because, of course, we have been members for over 40 years, and a huge number of our laws are intimately linked with European legislation. And indeed, much of our trade, of course, is with other members of the European Union. And in the course of my remarks, I'll look at trade, as well as immigration, students, and cultural diplomacy, while, of course, emphasizing the Commonwealth element. Now, the Daily Express, for one, amongst the newspapers, has been triumphant about the Brexit vote, arguing that this will mean that Britain can have much stronger links with the Commonwealth and totally recalibrate its trading relationships. Unfortunately, that is based on a rather uneconomic assumption in the sense that the amount of trade Britain has with even significant Commonwealth countries like Australia is considerably less than it has with its near neighbours in Europe, which is partly a reflection of geography, but also a reflection of our 40-year-old membership of the European Union. 44% of our trade is with other EU partners, just over 1% is with Australia, and therefore the articles that have appeared in the Daily Express and the Daily Mail and others suggesting that it will be easy just to switch our trading relations are frankly way off the mark. Now, it was rather odd during the EU referendum that all Commonwealth citizens legally resident in this country were able to vote, but EU citizens, with the exception, of course, of Brits and of Irish citizens, were not. Perhaps unfair, given that the EU citizens, of whom there are probably about 3 million, had most to lose by a vote in favour of Brexit. Now, at the moment, our trade, Britain's trade, is governed by European rules. We are, since being a member of the European Union, all our trade negotiations have been within the framework of European negotiations. And Europe, the European Union, is in the process at the moment of trying to finalize some often quite difficult trade talks with major partners. You probably have heard of the rather controversial transatlantic TTIP that the EU has been trying to bring to conclusion, not very successfully, but it's also been talking for 7 years to Canada, and we can expect trade agreements with many other members of the Commonwealth as well through the EU. And in fact, the EU, thanks to Britain's membership, does already have trade relationships and aid relationships with many of the Commonwealth member states, particularly those in Africa. 18 of the Commonwealth member states of the 53 are in Africa. And really from the 1970s onwards, thanks to Britain joining what was then the European Economic Community in 1973, a special relationship was established with those African former colonies as part of the so-called Lomé Convention. It wasn't just the former British territories, of course, it was the French, the Belgian, and so on, Portuguese. And so quite a complex and generous aid and trade package was worked out under the Lomé Convention, linking the EU to developing countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, but not Asia. The feeling at the time, and I covered the Lomé Convention negotiations when I worked as a journalist based in Brussels, was that countries such as India and Pakistan were just too big to be able to enter into such an aid and trade arrangement, and therefore separate things had to be negotiated. And many of those Commonwealth countries that have benefited from originally the Lomé Convention, which was then replaced by the Yaoundé Convention and more recently by bilateral economic partnerships, have really valued the fact that Britain within the EU has in a sense been able to champion the cause of particularly small and vulnerable Commonwealth countries. When Britain leaves the European Union, that will no longer be the case. Even if we have what has been called a soft Brexit rather than a hard Brexit, in other words, remaining part of the single market, though formally leaving the European Union, we will not be present at the regular meetings, not just of ministers, but of officials. So there will no longer be that British voice at the table when discussing the interests of Commonwealth countries, some of whom, such as Caribbean islands, depend on very limited number of commodities, sugar, bananas, and so on. As I say, Britain in the past always championed those causes, but that will no longer be possible in the post-Brexit world. Of course, trade isn't everything. There are other issues. Indeed, it is generally accepted that a substantial number of the slightly less than 52% of the people who voted on June the 23rd did so, those who voted to leave, did so because of concerns about immigration, and in particular, a wish to limit EU migration. Just to remind everyone, of course, as members of the EU, we are all part of the single market, and one of the four so-called freedoms of the single market is freedom of movement of people to work, to live, obviously to study as well in any of the 28 member states. And indeed, after 2004, when there was a dramatic expansion in the size of the European Union, taking in 8 former communist states, including 3 republics from the former Soviet Union, plus 2 Commonwealth islands, Malta and Cyprus, Britain was one of only a couple of countries that agreed that freedom of movement would operate immediately for the new member states. Other countries, such as Germany and France, insisted on a transition period. That was a major reason, of course, why so many Poles in particular came to Britain, and indeed Poles now make up the largest single ethnic community in this country. they've outnumbered even Indians. So in some parts of the country, not so much in London, which is multicultural, cosmopolitan, and has always dealt with immigration and diversity with a much more open approach. But in some parts of the country, there was undoubtedly resistance and even resentment to the sudden influx of workers from Central and Eastern European countries. This was despite the fact that, in fact, some of those workers were desperately needed because they were prepared to do things which unfortunately native Brits no longer were, such as picking fruit in East Anglia and other not very well paid and fairly arduous forms of labour. Now, when we leave, if indeed we do leave in 2019, that freedom of movement will be finished. In other words, new EU citizens will not be able to come here with the freedom that they enjoy at the moment, just as we, those of you who are British in the room, we Brits will not be able to similarly just go off and live in France or Spain or wherever, as has been the case up until now. But it's interesting to note, of course, that whereas particularly the conservative press railed against the fact that the last Prime Minister, David Cameron, had failed to meet his target to reduce immigration to tens of thousands as opposed to hundreds of thousands, that effort failed. Latest figures were the last year was over 300,000 new people moved to the United Kingdom. Business is happy about that because many of them are young, educated, and have contributed very considerably to the British economy. But there has been some difficulty of adjustment in some areas because of pressure of services. So one of the many simplistic arguments in the campaign by the Brexiteers, by those who were campaigning to leave, was if we leave the EU, we can take back control of our borders, and that will mean, therefore, we will not have so many Poles, Romanians, Bulgarians, etc., coming in. And to an extent that is true, but it is also worth pointing out that despite immigration controls that have evolved in this country since the 1960s, even last year, with over 300,000 coming in, a majority were not from the EU. They were from other parts of the world, and not least the Commonwealth. In many cases, family members joining people already here, or workers brought in to do specific things, which then raises the question, if EU migration is curtailed after Brexit, does that then mean that there will be a demand for more workers from the Commonwealth? Instead of Romanians picking fruit in East Anglia, will we be recruiting Bangladeshis and Indians to pick fruit? One or two ministers in the current government have argued that British workers ought to do these sorts of jobs, but I'll believe that when I see it, as British workers have got used to a rather more comfortable form of earning a living. So potentially, on the one hand, there may be actually an increase in opportunity for workers from the Commonwealth to come here, but because of the toxic nature of the immigration debate, I think it will be very difficult for any government, and particularly a Conservative government, to push that line. And linked to that is the issue of students. Now, this country, quite rightly, is proud of its academic institutions. In the latest international table, Oxford came out number 1, and several other British universities were in the top 10, along with mainly American universities. And Britain has been a magnet for students, not least from the Commonwealth, to come here to study university degrees, accountancy, all sorts of trades, as well as academic subjects. But the government has announced that as part of its campaign to limit immigration, it will be stricter on giving visas for students. This is bad for the universities, of course, because it will mean that they will get less money in fees. But I would argue it will also be bad for the Commonwealth because it will be more difficult for Indian, Pakistani, Nigerian, or whatever Commonwealth nationality the students come from to come to this country because of what I see to be as a major flaw of including student numbers in the immigration figures. So much of what I see for the future is actually quite gloomy. Those who believe or believed the message that was put out during the referendum campaign that Britain would recalibrate its relations so that the Commonwealth would become more important as it used to be than it is now, I think are actually deluded. It is true, and I think it's worthwhile remembering, that a major reason Britain did not join the infant European steel and coal community and then the European communities as they evolved was because of Commonwealth links. Although Winston Churchill during the war, towards the end of the war, had spoken about a European vision and the possibility of a united Europe, after the war he did not recommend that Britain should be part of this new shape of geography because of the strength of our ties with what was at that time mutating from empire to Commonwealth. And indeed much of our trading relationship was with Commonwealth countries. We, as people may remember, we imported butter from New Zealand and New Zealand lamb, things from Australia, which were, when we joined the European Union, largely substituted by European produce. But since then, many of the countries, not least Australia, who are in the Commonwealth, have recalibrated their own relationships. So for Australia, the important relationships are with China and Southeast Asia, no longer with what some used to think of as the home country. And I think it will be very difficult to alter that situation. But most of what I've been talking about has maybe been a little pessimistic, so let's try and give you some better news. And that would be in the field of cultural diplomacy, very much at the heart of this conference. I attended a very interesting event at the British Council just off Trafalgar Square a few days ago, at which the Chief Executive, Kieran Devan, spoke about his reaction to Brexit and what it would mean for the work of the British Council. He also introduced what for me was a new concept and one that I did find quite appealing, which was instead of thinking about hard Brexit, in other words, leaving the single market and basically trying to swim alone, having cut all ties with the European Union, or soft Brexit, where we stay in the European, not in the European Union, but in the single market, he spoke of rather closed and open Brexit. A closed Brexit where Britain would retire into its shell and become a, let's be frank about it, declining middle-sized country which has already been overtaken from the 5th position in the international league table by France, thanks to the devaluation of the pound over the last few weeks. We're now number 6, and we can be sure that we're on the way down because others are coming up fast to overtake us. So there is that possibility, if everything went wrong and the leadership from government was bad, that we would have a closed Britain, a closed Brexit. And as Kieran Devan said quite correctly, that would be a terrible mistake. What we need, if we're going to have Brexit, is an open Brexit, where Britain shows that it is open, not just for business, as the businesses are all trumpeting at the moment, but an open society, that we don't turn our back on Europe. After all, we are part of Europe, even if most British people never quite understood that bit of basic geography. But we should also be open to the Commonwealth as well, because there are very valuable links, cultural links of all kinds. And so, particularly in an age where communication is so easy, where even in African villages, many people have mobile phones and can do all sorts of not only banking transactions, but communications with people through their mobile phones. We have a world out there with which we should interact, at least as much as we do already. And so, in cultural diplomacy terms, Britain really does need to, or will need in the future, to, if it leaves the European Union, to rebrand itself and work out exactly what is the British brand, because from the point of view of many Commonwealth countries at the moment, we are Britain in the EU, and Britain outside the EU will be a different sort of brand. But it has to be an open brand, and British values and British arts and the creative industries have an enormous amount to offer. But before I give the impression that we're therefore able to sail off into some rosy future as rebranded Open Britain in an open world, I have to sound a note of caution, because actually it's in the creative industries, which to my mind are such an important part of cultural diplomacy, that there is most concern about Brexit. A survey was done through one of the creative industries federations before the vote, and 98% of respondents said they were voting to remain because they depended so much on the free movement of labour. Theatres, for example, that have not just technicians, but actors often who come from other European Union countries. Orchestras, football teams, you can name a whole raft of different cultural and sporting activities in which free movement has meant that Britain has an extremely high place in the creative industries and in sport. We saw again in Rio how the British team did extremely well, and British sport has been very good. But that shouldn't be a reason for us to descend into some sort of closed nationalism, but on the contrary, to make sure we remain absolutely international. And the creative industries themselves are crucial. Last year, the creative industries contributed £70 billion to the UK economy. That is a very significant amount indeed. It is also, interestingly, almost exactly twice the estimated cost of Brexit. According to figures released yesterday, it is going to cost Britain £35 billion to leave the European Union. For one reason, we're going to have to recruit hundreds of maybe, paradoxically, foreign trade negotiators, because we don't have any of our own anymore, because the EU did all our trade negotiations. So, yes, I promised I'd be optimistic towards the end, but I have to say that I don't think the picture is all that rosy. And there's a little bit of me, in fact, a big bit of me, that hopes that somehow, even though Theresa May has said Brexit means Brexit, when it comes to the crunch in 2 years' time, it won't actually happen. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. It was a really interesting lecture and very informative. Watching the news and based what you said, if so many of the EU citizens weren't enabled to vote, surely there's a legality issue here of selective choice, that it's not actually it's discriminatory in a way. I do know that at Mishcon de Rayon, there's a very strong feeling about the legalities, and they're looking very carefully into how they can challenge that they can come into power as they have no voting regarding this, and yet push this through without the public and the community having a say. And I would like to feel that the influence of the Parliament themselves and the House of Commons and the House of Lords are not just going to debate it, but seriously not enable them to push things through without a second voting, because I think a lot of people voted without the full facts, as we know. There were a lot of very indiscriminate promises made, and I think the immigration that everybody is so fearful of are the kind of immigration that's going to continue, because they are not applying to come into the country. They are actually forcing their way through the borders. And so we have a huge problem here, and I think if it was put now, the discussion, there would be a very different result. So I'm relying on the government to kind of influence and challenge and really make sure that the public's interests are looked after. If not, can London then be separate, and can we get a European passport?
Yes.
Did you see question time? Yes.
I didn't. No, I was at a meeting.
It's quite interesting about this point.
I mean, it is to be welcomed that Theresa May has taken a step backwards from her original idea that there would be no parliamentary debate. She herself alone would manage the Brexit process, even though there are the trio of ministers who, in principle, are dealing with it. So the fact that there is going to be a debate is a step in the right direction. Of course, I absolutely agree with your other comments. And it's interesting that there is not only that particular legal challenge, but there are others in the pipeline, including from EU nationals themselves who've crowdfunded a case which will say that it is grotesque that they were allowed to vote in local elections and European elections, but were not allowed to vote in the EU referendum, even though they are the people most directly concerned. And many of them, of course, are indeed very concerned at the moment because their situation is not certain yet. David Davis, the Minister for Brexit, said only last week that they would be a negotiating ploy or a negotiating card in the Brexit negotiations, whether they're allowed to stay or not. And this is awful for people, many of whom have been here for years, whose children are at schools, and it's really, I think, absolutely shameful. So there's one sort of part of me, which maybe sound rather Machiavellian, which believes that everything is going to really start to get bad when Article 50 is invoked. And at that stage, there may well be a clamour not only amongst MPs, but actually amongst the public to stop this before it goes any further. There's a big legal debate about whether it is possible to withdraw Article 50 if you once invoke it, and lawyers are not in agreement about that. The man who actually drafted it, who was British, ironically, Sir John Kerr, who was our permanent representative at the time, believes that it is possible to withdraw it, but whether our partners in Europe would be happy for us to do that is another matter, because the damage it has done to Britain's image amongst our EU partners is absolutely enormous. And this is why someone like François Hollande, the French president, is basically saying, well, just get on with it and go, because it is undermining the whole European Union.
Okay, there's another question.
Yes. Hi, Peter. I'm Maltese, so I share the sort of, we're European Union members and in the Commonwealth.
Yes.
And I wonder whether one of the issues talking about culture is that really we're talking about identity. And so Brexit in some ways is this rejection of a European identity, or at least a European Union identity. In Malta, and according to the latest, as I'm sure you know, Eurobarometer data, more and more Europeans feel part of some kind of European identity, and the EU is spending a lot of money to encourage that. I don't think Commonwealth identity is particularly salient in Malta. It's certainly not something people would say that they felt part of. And maybe that's because really and truly to be part of the Commonwealth means to acknowledge and sit with the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. How can Britain, moving beyond Brexit, moving beyond the European Union, find a way to make being part of the Commonwealth attractive and enriching? And is that something which is being worked on?
Would be great, actually.
It's an interesting challenge and a very valid point. I mean, clearly,
Thank you very
Britain is no longer, in any sense, in the driving seat in the Commonwealth. The Queen may be the head of the Commonwealth, but that is purely as a figurehead, much as she values the institution. It really will be up to the Commonwealth Secretariat to work out how it may or may not be able to promote Commonwealth identity. But I suspect that that will not be, in a sense, to compensate for any loss of European identity amongst Brits. I have to say, you're absolutely right, identity is a core issue, and I really regret that no British government, whether Conservative or Labour, or even the coalition from 2010 or to 2015, ever made the case for Europe, ever explained what the European Union does, why it is good that we're a member of the European Union, and promoted European citizenship. And the tragedy is that, of course, the rise of UKIP meant that the governments were frightened of being accused of propaganda in favour of the EU. So it's absolutely correct that Britain doesn't have anywhere near as strong a European identity as most of the countries, including your own Malta and indeed Cyprus and others, which is, I find, very sad. But we are going through an existential crisis in Britain. What is British identity? Who are we exactly? And maybe the tumult of the next 2 years is going to give us an opportunity to come up with the answer, and maybe we will find parts of Britain will come up with different answers. We already know what Scotland thinks. Scotland and Northern Ireland both voted to stay in, and Scotland in particular, it does have a European identity. So I would argue does London. London voted overwhelmingly to stay in the European Union, and I'm delighted that the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, has pledged very forcefully to make sure that London is open for business, and London will have the strongest possible relations with our EU partners. Now, as we say, because we don't know what sort of Brexit it's going to be, we can only guess what sort of strong relationship will be possible. But absolutely right, identity is core.
A very brief comment and maybe another question. My name is Esteban. I am working here with the ICD. Thank you for your speech because I agree with the several things that you deliver here. And I have a comment and a short question. And the comment is brief. It's like, even what you say now that I fully agree, and some of the questions that have been done here, sometimes, you know, I'm going to make a comparison. I like to speak like that. I am not an alcoholic, but I heard that in order to escape from that problem, the first thing you have to do is to realize that you are an alcoholic. So the problem of the Brexit, I think, is a deeper problem, you know. I mean, it's not coming out just because the current situation. I think it's something that is coming from time ago, and it's coming from how is the society living, especially maybe the lower level, you know, less cultivated people, you know, they have less opportunities maybe, and this is creating, you know, that moving forward in a world that the rich people is getting richer, and the poor people is getting even, the life is getting harder, you know, and it's also a problem of education, you know. In addition to that, these people, they don't have the chance to travel too much, to interact with another people, you know, to discover another cultures and so on. And there is a very funny sentence that it says that 20, 30 years ago, we had Johnny Cash, you know, somebody called Hope, and Steve Jobs. Today, we have no Cash, no Jobs, and no Hope. And the point is, yeah, now my question is, how do you think that, you know, fields like cultural diplomacy can move forward the society, the problems that we are having today, that they are, the several part of them related to culture, you know, in order to move forward, you know, with these differences? Because, you know, the main problem, you know, it's very deep and very strong, but one of the big problems, talking yesterday with friends, I was meeting with them, why some people voted Brexit is because they don't have too many chances to improve the labor market. I mean, they are, let's say, sorry for the word, stuck in a labor market, and more people are coming from abroad, because for them, what is annoying is the migration, that they are in the same level of them. I mean, it's the football like the football stars. For you, a person is working in the construction is a migrant, but somebody coming maybe from whatever part of the world that is rich and is a football star is not a migrant, is a football star. But at the end, that person is coming to play to Arsenal, Chelsea, or whatever, that is coming from ESU or whatever, is also a migrant. But they don't see this in that way. So yeah, I would like to know from you how cultural diplomacy, for example, in education can improve, you know, this lack of knowledge and so on.
Okay, you raised quite a number of important points there, so I'll comment on just a few. It was very interesting to see the opinion poll research or research organisations' findings about who voted for Brexit and why. And we know that basically the younger you were, the more likely you were to vote to remain. And it was people of 65 plus who were voting overwhelmingly to leave, which suggests a very interesting fact that the older people had never really understood, not all of them of course, but the majority had never really understood the benefits of the European Union. You're absolutely right, yes, education was key. The more people who have a degree overwhelmingly voted to remain. People who had only secondary school education voted overwhelmingly to leave. Similarly, I agree that to an extent the Brexit vote was a rejection of globalization by people who have not benefited from globalization. It was a way of giving a kick to the new international order from people who don't think it's wonderful that we have freedom of movement because it just doesn't affect them except negatively. How can we use cultural diplomacy to promote things? A lot will depend, as I say, on whether we have the closed Brexit or the open Brexit, because, for example, one reason why so many young people do have a European identity and could see the point of the European Union is thanks to Erasmus Plus, originally for students, now to other professions as well, which gave young people the opportunity to study or work in another European country and to broaden their experience and greatly improve their employment chances afterwards. It's absolutely essential, I believe, that we do have an open Brexit in which Erasmus is still possible for British students and workers, because otherwise we really will be cutting off our nose to spite our face. And I hope that even if we do leave, and I think it's 99% certain we will, not 100%, then we must, through our diplomatic service, but also through the British Council that I mentioned, really step up cultural diplomacy, both with the Commonwealth and with the European Union, because, as I said in my talk, we will no longer be there at the table in European Union meetings, but we mustn't let that sever the very real ties that do exist culturally. And in the meantime, it would be really good if the British education system, in schools in particular, actually brought back compulsory languages for students and taught people about part of our shared European culture.
Okay. Yeah, good morning. Okay, I'm Vincent from Nigeria. My question is in this form. You know, sometimes when one demands for freedom, the freedom may lead either into a positive or negative aspects. Because looking at Brexit, is there any sign of maybe light at the end of the tunnel? Looking at, Britain, separated from EU, and then what are the hopes of Commonwealth countries? When I mention Commonwealth countries, I'm speaking from the angle of Africa. What are their hopes on this new, towards in this new Brexit, and then what are the things that still stand to benefit and stand to lose when Britain and EU was still together? Thank you.
Yes, well, as I mentioned in my talk, I don't think we will see a huge increase in trade between Britain and Commonwealth countries. It just isn't going to happen. And therefore, that's why I believe it's absolutely essential that we do stay in the single market in order to maintain our trade links with the Commonwealth. As you know, the pound has collapsed, and this has, although it's been greeted with joy by the hospitality industry in London, which is suddenly much more attractive to foreign visitors, it's not good news for British people and their travel, and also for the stability of the economy. And we're going to be hit very hard by price rises, having enjoyed very low inflation for a while. So what about the rest of the Commonwealth? I wish I could offer you light at the end of the tunnel, but I don't think actually there will be a huge change in our relationship with countries in the Commonwealth to compensate for a reduction in links with the European Union. I also have to say, in parentheses, one of the most depressing things for me about the whole EU referendum was the narrative that came from the Leave side that was talking about Britain will now get its independence back, and even on June the 24th, some of our favourite hatred newspapers had Independence Day, we are now free, apart from the fact, as I mentioned, we will still be in the EU until at least March 2019. It's a complete fantasy. In a modern globalised world, you're automatically part of all sorts of relations and things, and this idea that somehow we are free and now we can establish really intense relations with the Commonwealth, I think is frankly fantasy, unfortunately.
Good morning. I just have a brief question. My name is Aygün Remjanova. I'm one of the PhD students with the ICD. I just had a brief question about what do you think will be the effect of Brexit on UK's relations with countries outside of the EU and outside of the Commonwealth? For instance, I come from Kazakhstan. So what could this mean, for example, for Kazakhstani students wishing to come to study? Probably it will be two-way, but I just wanted to hear your opinion on
Yes,
that.
I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, Britain is the largest single investor in Kazakhstan, and there are very good relations with Central Asia in general. So in that sense, I think there will be an attempt to boost trade and cultural relations with Central Asia, with the Gulf countries, for example. But again, I don't think we should overestimate what the potential is. I think for students from Kazakhstan, they will also fall in the net that I mentioned. You know, if the government is pressing ahead with trying to limit the numbers of students, that will include Kazakh students, I'm afraid, as well as as all the others. With the rest of the world, we have to, I think, take very seriously what Barack Obama said before the vote and has reiterated since the vote, that it was not in Britain's interests and it was not in the interests of the United States for Britain to leave the European Union. One of the main reasons that America is so interested in Britain and several others is because it's a gateway to the European Union. And if we close that gate, we really will be heading backwards. So there is general dismay. I've travelled a lot since June the 23rd and spoken in a number of different countries and tried to sound out opinion there. And there is almost uniformly, whether they're EU member states or not, absolute amazement in a negative sense. They just cannot understand why this has happened. And even our best friends are sort of saying, well, you know, you've got to now try and make the best of it, but do you really realize what you've done?
Maybe one more question. I don't want to keep the High Commissioner meeting. I'm not sure who's first. Ladies first, maybe? I think okay. And then we'll do.
You were first. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you for your enlightening talk. My name is Epi. I'm from London for Refugees. We come up with various projects to help support refugees integrate better into society. So my question is, what do you think is the effect of Brexit on refugees, for example, in light of Calais saying move back your borders and they're destroying the Calais camps? What sort of hope is there, already seeing that there's difficulty in looking after, well, the immigration status itself? What effect will Brexit have on refugees?
Again, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but it depends on what sort of Brexit it is, because I find it a matter of great regret that Britain hasn't really taken full part in the creation of a Europe-wide asylum and refugee policy, which is, I think, what the European Union needs, particularly because of the size of the problem with so many millions fleeing not only the conflicts in the Middle East, but poverty and oppression in Eritrea and other such places. If Brexit goes ahead, as we assume it will, then Britain will have its own policy, but it cannot expect firm cooperation from EU member states if we have opted out. This really will mean it will be entirely up to the British government. And the sad thing is, which is another reason why, you know, I don't think not only people working in refugee issues, but also people from the Commonwealth shouldn't be too hopeful in the short term, because the British government is going to be bogged down for at least 2 years with the negotiations to leave, and then after we leave, at least 5 to 10 years trying to negotiate bilateral trade deals with other countries in the world. It really is a nightmare scenario, and the civil service is going to be absolutely clogged with all this work. And therefore, I'm afraid the likelihood of positive initiatives on refugee policy, for example, is remote.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. My question is very brief. We often hear about soft and hard exit, Brexit. What does it mean, and what would be the effect of this withdrawal on the UK? Economical-wise, and also on the EU citizens living in UK. Thank you.
Well, in a nutshell, the difference between soft and hard Brexit is centred on whether we remain a member of the European single market or not. Economically, that's important because it means, therefore, we can sell without tariffs and other barriers to the other 450 million people in the European Union. And indeed, it's interesting to note it was a British European Commissioner, Lord Cofield, a Conservative, who steered through that single market legislation. So a hard Brexit, which is what, until a few days ago, was basically the message coming out of certainly David Davis and Liam Fox, and to an extent Theresa May at the Conservative Party conference, would mean no automatic access to the single market, which would mean British goods would suffer tariffs, which will hit our exports very severely. What the government does seem determined to do is not allow continuation of free movement, though David Davis said that free movement of people will be a negotiating card in the negotiations, which has left those who are here in limbo. MPs of all parties in the House of Commons have been calling for a guarantee that EU citizens now here should have the right to remain, and reciprocally that British EU citizens on the continent should be able to remain there. But that is still not clear at all. So it could have a huge impact on migrants who are already here, and it would mean, as I mentioned earlier, that future EU migrants would not have the automatic right to come here as they do at present, and will continue to do while we're a member of the EU. Thank you.